Right now, thousands of miles away from your screen, tankers loaded with oil and gas are sitting almost frozen at the edge of a narrow waterway. Captains are waiting for orders that never come. Engines are idling. Deadlines are blown. Markets are panicking. And the entire global economy is feeling the pressure from one choke point on the map, the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices have blasted past the $120 mark and refused to come back down. Refineries across the Gulf have gone dark. Banks and wealthy capitals have literally closed their doors in the middle of the day. All of this chaos is being driven not by a fleet of billion-dollar warships, not by some futuristic stealth armada, but by cheap drones and small, expendable weapons that cost less than a luxury car. But here's the part almost no one is talking about. Deep inside Iranian territory, far away from the cameras focused on the ships, something else is burning. One factory at a time, one engine plant at a time, one warehouse at a time. And the jet doing most of that burning isn't invisible, isn't new, and doesn't even claim to be stealth. It's a twin-engine beast that first flew decades ago and is now rewriting the rules of modern warfare in the skies above Iran. The F-15E Strike Eagle. In this video, you're going to see how a non-stealth American fighter became the most feared aircraft in the Middle East almost overnight. Why Iran's leadership knows, even if it won't admit it publicly, that it is running out of options, and how an unexpected partnership with a country thousands of kilometers away could flip the economics of drone warfare completely on its head. On February 28, 2026, a single set of orders left Washington and kicked off one of the most consequential U.S. military campaigns in decades. The directive came straight from President Donald Trump. Its name, Operation Epic Fury. On paper, the goals sounded simple, almost clinical. First, prevent Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon. Second, destroy its missile arsenal and the sites that build and store those missiles. Third, cripple the web of proxy forces that Tehran uses to hit targets across the region without getting its own hands directly dirty. And fourth, annihilate Iran's navy so thoroughly that it could no longer threaten shipping lanes or coastal infrastructure. Those were the official objectives, the ones listed on government websites and repeated in press briefings. But analysts watching from the outside noticed something that went deeper. Think tanks and strategic research centers started quietly pointing out a fifth goal hiding underneath the public list. Not just weakening the Iranian regime from the outside, but hollowing it out from within. The logic was brutal and simple. Don't just blow up hardware. Go after the infrastructure of power. Hit the factories that generate money. Hit the networks that keep the security forces paid. Hit the communications and command systems that let the regime coordinate repression. Create so much structural damage that it's not foreign bombs that finish the job, but the regime's own people when they see that the center can no longer hold. If that sounds extreme, remember something important. This was not America's first strike campaign against Iran. Less than a year earlier, in June 2025, U.S. bombers had carried out Operation Midnight Hammer, a focused nuclear strike mission that targeted Iran's most important uranium enrichment facilities. Those bombers flew in the dark, hit a small number of very specific sites, and left. It was surgical, limited, and designed to solve one problem. Epic Fury was something else entirely. This time, the goal wasn't to pull a single tooth, it was to break the jaw. Entire categories of military power were on the chopping block: ballistic missiles, naval capacity, drone production, air defense networks, command centers, research hubs. The idea was not to poke holes in Iran's capabilities, but to erase them from the map, one strike package at a time. In the opening hours, U.S. forces unleashed waves of Tomahawk cruise missiles from ships and submarines. They slammed into naval bases along Iran's southern coast. Piers stacked with patrol boats and larger vessels were torn apart before a single anchor could be raised. Facilities at Bandar Abbas, sitting like a gatekeeper at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, took direct hits. Installations at Chabahar and other Gulf of Oman locations were struck almost simultaneously. Reports soon suggested that more than 100 Iranian naval vessels were either destroyed outright or left crippled at their moorings. Ships that were supposed to surge out into the Gulf never even left the pier. From the outside, it looked like the first stage of the campaign was working perfectly. Iran's navy was bleeding. Its coastal defenses were under stress. And American air power was just getting started. By the first days of March, flight tracking and defense reporting outlets were noting something that would have been unthinkable not long before. U.S. fighter jets were operating directly over Iran's capital. That shift signaled something critical. Iran's much-advertised integrated air defense system, especially around Tehran, had been degraded far faster than expected. More than 100 American fighters poured into the theater, F-16s for versatile multi-role missions, F-35s using their advanced sensors to sweep the sky, A-10s for close air support if ground engagements escalated. A small but potent detachment of F-22 Raptors, not because Iran's own air force posed a serious threat, years of sanctions had starved it of parts and upgrades, but because their presence sent a message to every other regional power that might have been tempted to test the US. Russia was watching. So was China. So were Gulf monarchies and European capitals that depend on the steady flow of energy through the strait. The signal was clear, the US was all in. But while the world's cameras fixated on the big strategic picture, something more subtle and more dangerous was forming in the narrow channel that all those tankers needed to pass through. Iran was about to play a different kind of game. Almost from the moment the first Tomahawks flew, Iran revealed its countermove. It didn't try to meet the US head-on in a conventional naval battle. It didn't send its remaining large warships charging directly at US destroyers and cruisers. That would have been suicidal. Instead, it turned to a mix of weapons that didn't look impressive on paper, but were perfectly tuned to exploit a specific weakness in modern Western defenses. The strategy had 3 pillars. The first pillar was sporadic anti-ship missile launches, not a constant barrage, but just enough to make the risk impossible to ignore. A tanker captain might sail for hours without seeing any threat, only to be startled by reports of a missile splashdown not far from his route. Every safe journey made the next one more psychologically tense, because no one knew when the next missile would appear on radar. The second pillar was fast attack craft. Small, aggressive speedboats loaded with weapons and crewed by sailors trained to close distance quickly. Against a warship, they might be suicidal. Against a slow-moving commercial vessel with minimal defenses, they were terrifying. Get close enough, move fast enough, and even a single explosive run could open a ship's hull and send it limping back to port or worse. The third pillar was the one that truly changed everything. Drones. Iran began launching Shahed-series drones in large numbers, sending them in swarms across the water and over critical infrastructure. Some went after Gulf state targets, oil facilities, refineries, and industrial complexes. Others hunted merchant ships, looking for weak points, exposed decks, or key systems to strike. The war suddenly had a sky full of cheap, expendable aircraft that could be manufactured in bulk, launched relentlessly, and replaced quickly. As days turned into weeks, the numbers told the story. Hundreds of drones had been fired. More than 1,000 ships were effectively blocked from entering or exiting the strait. Some captains refused to move without military escorts that simply did not exist in enough quantity to cover everyone. Others obeyed insurance mandates that made sailing into the danger zone financially impossible. Iran added another twist. It quietly allowed ships from a small group of favored countries to pass with far fewer delays. Vessels connected to China, Russia, and a handful of partners seemed to find their way through while others sat waiting. On paper, Tehran talked about protecting maritime security. In practice, it was using the strait as leverage, squeezing some economies while offering relief to others. The global economy started to seize. Oil pushed above $120 a barrel and stayed there. Major facilities, including critical refineries, were hit by drones and forced offline. Banks and corporations announced unexpected closures and emergency plans. The world could see the impact but struggled to respond in time. And behind all this, there was a brutal piece of math working in Iran's favor. A single Shahed drone can be built for tens of thousands of dollars. Estimates put many of them in the $20,000 to $50,000 range. By contrast, a single high-end interceptor missile, like those fired from major Western air defense systems, can cost several $million per shot. Each engagement meant spending a fortune to swat something that could be replaced cheaply. Iran had reportedly built up the capacity to produce as many as 10,000 drones per month. That kind of industrial base gave it confidence that any drone it lost could be replaced quickly. At the rate they were firing, the math suggested they could keep up the blockade for a long time, unless someone decided to change the equation. And that's where the F-15E Strike Eagle entered the story in a way few people anticipated. The F-15E is not a stealth jet. It doesn't try to melt into the background or sneak past radar networks unseen. It's big, loud, and unmistakable once you know what to look for. On paper, that might sound like a weakness in modern air warfare. In the skies over Iran, it turned out to be exactly what the US needed. Built as a tactical, all-weather multi-role fighter, the Strike Eagle is designed to do a little bit of everything and do it at speed. It can climb fast, hit hard, and stay in the fight longer than many aircraft its age. In the configuration used for Epic Fury, it was loaded with precision-guided bombs, air-to-air missiles, and a powerful internal cannon. This thing is fast, pushing into the Mach 2 range, which means it can scream in over the strait, patrol the entire length of that 100-mile channel in minutes, and then turn inland if needed. Its range gives it the ability to take off from secure bases in the region, fly deep into Iranian airspace, smash critical targets, and come home without constantly refueling. For a campaign that needed sustained pressure, that endurance mattered. On its wings, it can carry Sidewinder missiles for close-range air-to-air encounters and AMRAAM missiles for longer-range threats. Underneath, it can mount guided bombs fitted with kits that turn them into precision weapons capable of hitting single buildings, specific hangars, and even individual sections of large complexes. Its cannon, a 20mm 6-barrel Gatling gun, gives it the ability to rip apart drones or small boats at close range if they get too near. In other words, the Strike Eagle doesn't have to choose between being a fighter and a bomber. It is both at the same time. But its biggest advantage in Epic Fury wasn't just its payload, it was the battlefield it was flying over. By the time F-15Es were fully unleashed deep inside Iran, much of the country's air defense network had already been battered by earlier waves of strikes. Radar sites had been hit, command centers had taken damage, communications lines that tied batteries together into an integrated system had been disrupted. What was left was a patchwork, not a shield. That allowed the Strike Eagles to do something different. Instead of worrying about every radar ping, they could move systematically from target to target, focusing on a very specific set of objectives, the production backbone of Iran's drone war. One mission in particular sent a clear message. In the city of Kerman, there was a facility that didn't look like much from the outside to casual observers. No massive missile silos, no dramatic parade-ready equipment. But inside, it housed the engine production lines that powered many of Iran's Shahed drones. It built the hearts of the aircraft that were terrorizing the strait and hammering regional infrastructure. When US planners mapped out how to truly blunt Iran's drone campaign, that plant lit up as a priority target. Reports soon emerged that a combined strike, heavily featuring F-15E aircraft, had hit the Kerman facility with devastating effect. Satellite imagery released afterward showed the difference clearly. Earlier images captured rows of buildings, intact roofs, and visible signs of industrial activity. Later shots showed craters, collapsed walls, and scorched earth. This was not a symbolic hit on a random warehouse. It was a direct blow to a node that connected research, production, and deployment. Remove the engines, and the drone airframes sitting in other factories become useless shells. The strategy behind this was straightforward, but powerful. Instead of burning a fortune trying to shoot every drone out of the sky, go after the factories, the machine tools, and the specialized assembly lines. Kill the supply at its source. Even if Iran still had stockpiles waiting in hangars, every month of lost production bought time and shifted the long-term balance. Analysts weighing the effect of strikes like Kerman highlighted that every destroyed plant didn't just mean fewer drones, it meant lost technical knowledge, scattered teams, and disrupted supply chains. Everything from specialized metal castings to imported electronics would now have to be rerouted, reassembled, or rebuilt somewhere else under increasingly difficult conditions. The F-15E was at the center of this new doctrine. Fly in, hit the production sites, then pivot back to the coast to hunt what remained in the air and on the water. One sortie could disrupt an engine line, another could crater a storage complex, another could strafe small vessels attempting to harass commercial shipping. With each one of these missions, Iran's confidence in its drone-driven strategy eroded, not that the regime could ever admit that publicly, because while the Strike Eagles were tearing into its industrial base, something else was happening to Iran's ability to even contest the skies. Before Epic Fury began, Iran had invested heavily in a layered air defense system. On slides and in briefings, it looked formidable. Long-range surface-to-air missiles, medium-range systems, short-range units to protect critical infrastructure, a network of radars feeding into command centers designed to coordinate responses and make sure no single aircraft could move freely without risk. This kind of architecture, when functioning, is exactly the kind of thing that should make a non-stealth aircraft's life difficult. The F-15E is fast and powerful, but it is not invisible. In theory, a dense and well-coordinated defense could force it to keep its distance or risk losses. In practice, that's not what happened. As strike after strike landed, reports from defense analysis outlets began to describe a pattern. Iran's air defense units were no longer operating as a cohesive, integrated network. Instead, individual systems were being moved around, fired once or twice, and then relocated quickly to avoid counterstrikes. The phrase that kept coming up was shoot and scoot. On paper, that might sound like agile guerrilla warfare in the air defense domain. In reality, it's often a sign that higher-level command and control has broken down. When your operators are wheeling launches around on their own, firing in isolation, and sprinting away from imagined retaliation, they're not executing a unified plan. They're just trying not to die. Then came one of the most telling numbers of the entire campaign. US Central Command revealed that coalition aircraft had flown more than 8,000 combat sorties over Iranian territory since the beginning of Epic Fury. 8,000. And in all of those missions, Iran had not managed to shoot down a single US fighter. Not one. That doesn't mean there was zero danger. Any radar blip still gets attention, any missile launch is taken seriously. But as those 8,000 flights stacked up, the message was clear. Iran's ability to actually contest control of its own airspace had effectively collapsed. For pilots flying F-15Es, that reality mattered. It meant missions could be planned with more flexibility. It meant routes could be optimized to hit priority targets, rather than detouring constantly to avoid certain zones. It meant that Strike Eagles could not only attack production sites, but circle back to loiter over the strait, ready to intercept new threats to shipping in real time. Iran's own state media tried to tell a different story. At one point, broadcasters began circulating claims that an American F-15 had been shot down over Iranian soil. The narrative was clearly crafted to project strength. Proof they wanted their population to believe that even under heavy pressure, the regime could still knock high-end American jets out of the sky. The problem was that there was no wreckage, no independent confirmation, and no supporting evidence. U.S. Central Command responded bluntly, stating that the reports were false and reaffirming that not a single U.S. fighter had been lost in the campaign. In authoritarian systems, that kind of lie isn't about military reality. It's about buying time at home, when people can see smoke rising from factories, hear explosions in the distance, and read rumors about negotiations. Telling them you shot down an enemy jet is a way of saying, we're still strong, we still have teeth. But lies can only cover so much when the foundations of power are shaking. And inside Iran, those foundations were starting to crack. Long before the first bomb fell under Operation Epic Fury, Iran's population was already under immense strain. Years of sanctions, mismanagement, and corruption had left the economy in a weakened state. Inflation punished ordinary citizens. Job opportunities dried up. The cost of basic goods climbed while wages failed to keep pace. Protests had erupted repeatedly over the years. Some were sparked by specific incidents, cases of police brutality, public scandals, or visible corruption. Others were driven by more general despair. People fed up with living in a system that seemed incapable of delivering stability or dignity. In many cases, security forces managed to suppress the demonstrations, but grievances never truly disappeared. They simmered. When the war escalated and epic fury began, those underlying tensions didn't vanish. They intensified. Strikes on military infrastructure might have looked like remote events on maps, but they carried direct consequences. Defense factories employed tens of thousands. Supply chains connected into broader segments of the economy. As facilities were destroyed or disrupted, people lost jobs, shipments were delayed, and money stopped flowing. Analysts studying the situation inside Iran started to talk about a tipping point, not the dramatic movie version where millions flood into the streets overnight, but a slower, more dangerous shift. In that version, a regime doesn't crumble the moment the first missile hits. It cracks when enough internal systems stop working, when command chains get thin, and when security forces lose the sense that the people ordering them to act are fully in control. By late March, 2 of the 3 classic conditions for serious internal unrest looked increasingly present. Leadership structures had taken hits. Infrastructure supporting the regime's power, especially in the defense sector, was being shredded day by day. The third condition, a population both desperate and convinced that change was possible, was harder to measure from the outside, but reports suggested that anger and frustration were rising. Against this backdrop, Iran's foreign minister began to send carefully worded signals. Behind closed doors, messages emerged hinting that the government was ready to talk. Phrases like closing the issue quickly and references to having the supreme leader's permission to explore negotiations began circulating in diplomatic circles. At the same time, the United States adjusted its posture just enough to create an opening. President Trump issued a public ultimatum: cease attacks in the Strait of Hormuz or face strikes on Iran's own energy infrastructure. Those words were not idle. Targeting energy production would have plunged the Iranian economy into even deeper crisis and risked sparking broader unrest. Then, in a move that grabbed global attention, Trump announced a temporary pause. For 5 days, he said, the U.S. would refrain from hitting Iran's power plants and energy sites, provided that ongoing discussions showed progress. It was a narrow window, but it was a window. Iran's leadership misread the moment. Instead of easing the blockade, it doubled down. Officials announced that merchant ships could pass the strait if they paid hefty fees, reportedly up to $2 million per vessel. It was a move that looked more like extortion than diplomacy. Pay us or your cargo stays stuck. At the same time, hardline factions renewed their insistence that the strait would remain closed under Iran's terms. U.S. commanders described this behavior for what it looked like: desperation. Coalition monitoring showed that in just a couple of weeks, Iran had carried out hundreds of deliberate attacks on civilian targets. Every drone strike on a non-military facility, every missile launched near a commercial ship, reinforced the picture of a regime that had run out of smart options and was now lashing out, hoping to scare others into backing down. With its navy gutted, its air defenses shattered, its drone factories burning, and its economy under increasing pressure, Iran was running out of cards to play. But it still had one thing that could cause serious damage in the short term: existing stockpiles of drones. And that's where a new partner entered the story, one that knew those drones all too well. For years, Ukraine has been on the receiving end of the same Shahed series drones that Iran was now using over the Gulf. Launched by Russia against Ukrainian cities, power plants, and infrastructure, those drones had become a constant menace. Ukraine had to adapt quickly and cheaply. High-cost interceptors were never an option at the scale needed, so Ukrainian engineers, soldiers, and volunteers began experimenting with alternative solutions. They built and refined drone-on-drone interception systems, scrambling small, nimble aircraft that could track and collide with or disable incoming Shaheeds at a fraction of the cost. They repurposed existing technology, tested new tactics, and created a whole new mini-industry around affordable air defense. Over time, these systems improved. They learned how to recognize drone signatures faster, coordinate responses, and position interceptors in ways that forced attacking drones into kill zones or away from valuable targets. And crucially, they did all of this for far less money per engagement than a traditional missile-based system would demand. As Epic Fury unfolded and Iran relied more and more on its drone swarms, reports began to emerge that the US and Ukraine were in discussions about deploying some of these interceptor concepts to the Gulf region. The logic was compelling. On one side, you had American F-15E Strike Eagles flying high-end missions, destroying factories, engine plants, storage depots, and command nodes. They were ripping out the roots of Iran's drone war. On the other side, you had Ukraine's low-cost defensive innovations, perfectly suited to swatting individual drones out of the sky cheaply and efficiently. Put together, that meant hitting the problem from both ends. F-15Es would make sure fewer drones could be built tomorrow. Ukrainian-style interceptors would make sure the drones that still existed today had a much harder time reaching their targets. Instead of firing a $4 million missile at a $20,000 drone, defenders could send a cheaper counter-drone or similar system into the air and neutralize the threat at a more sustainable cost. For Iran, this emerging partnership threatened to completely break the math it had been relying on. The advantage of cheap offensive drones disappears fast when your opponent finds an even cheaper way to stop them and is simultaneously pulverizing your factories. As word of these talks circulated, it became clear that the drone war over the Strait of Hormuz was about to enter a new phase, not just technologically, but strategically. And the F-15E remained one of the main tools ensuring that Iran couldn't rebuild its capabilities while that shift unfolded. Zoom out to the big picture, and the speed of the transformation is startling. At the start of Operation Epic Fury, Iran thought it held a strong hand. It had built up a large arsenal of missiles. It had a navy capable of harassing traffic in one of the world's most important waterways. It had a drone industry that could turn out thousands of Shaheeds a month. It had an air defense network it believed could deter or punish foreign jets. And it had proxy forces across the region ready to cause trouble if outside powers pushed too hard. Within just a few weeks, that landscape looked very different. More than 100 naval vessels were gone or in no condition to fight. Key missile production lines had been shut down, perhaps for years. Air defense networks had been fragmented into scattered launchers, playing hide-and-seek instead of forming a true shield. Drone engine plants had been turned into rubble. Research centers and military-industrial complexes had taken serious damage. Most strikingly, thousands of U.S. sorties had been flown over Iranian airspace without a single American fighter being shot down. That statistic alone sent a message to every government watching. Whatever Iran's leaders were claiming at home, they did not control their own skies in any meaningful sense. Through every phase of that process, the F-15E Strike Eagle was present. It hit missile sites early in the campaign. It hammered drone factories and supply depots as the operation progressed. It patrolled the strait itself, looking for fast attack boats and hunting drones that tried to slip through. It worked alongside other aircraft and systems, but often ended up as the jet Iran chose to lie about shooting down precisely because it symbolized the campaign's success.